Welcome to Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston, PhD. Dr. Glenn is a clinical psychologist and former multi-million-dollar consultant to the big food industry and uses his experience to help you defeat your cravings. This show will help you to focus on dramatically reducing cravings and leaving the diet mentality behind, so you can more easily and effortlessly achieve your health, fitness, and body composition goals. Please remember, no doctor-patient relationship is created via this show, and you are responsible for confirming any changes to your diet, health, or psychological routines with an appropriately licensed professional before implementing them. Before we get started, if you haven't downloaded the free smartphone app to access dozens of these recordings all in one place, as well as to avail yourself of a confidential community for support, motivation, and assistance, please visit the podcast link on defeatyourcravings.com as soon as possible. And now, here's your host, Dr. Glenn Livingston.
Hey, it's the very good Dr. Glenn Livingston with defeatyourcravings.com. And I am here with a kind-hearted gentleman named Robert, who I've actually worked with before. We had a little trouble with our recording. And so we're coming back again to follow up on everything that happened, which is kind of an interesting perspective anyway, because people like to know what happens after the first session. So, Robert, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. So catch me up. If you could summarize what we talked about last time and let me know how it went for you, and then let me know what you might need help with, any interesting observations you have, any struggles you're having, and let's see if we can make this work.
Yeah. So last time we talked, I was having a bit of trouble with eating sugary foods, specifically usually when I was sick. Now, the sugary foods were not too much of an issue when I wasn't sick, but I found that when I was sick, it was almost like it kind of zapped my willpower, I guess, to some extent. And then I would just crave these sugary foods. At one point, it led to a couple of pretty severe binges, which was quite upsetting because I had been binge-free for quite some time before that. We came up with a rule that I wasn't going to eat sugary foods when I was sick. After we talked, I kind of decided, you know what? I think this is a rule that maybe I should just keep regardless of my health status. I was kind of like, you know what? These sugary foods, I might be able to handle it when I'm not sick, but I might as well just not eat them anyway. And to be honest, it's been extremely helpful just avoiding those foods altogether. It's actually been going quite well since the last time we talked, which was maybe 3 weeks, a month ago or so.
That's nice to hear. I guess no doctor has diagnosed you with a sugary food deficiency?
No, I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but I can't imagine that it would.
No, I'm just joking around a little bit. Just because you can get away with something doesn't necessarily mean that you should, right? If you feel safer having a kind of hard and fast boundary that protects you no matter what life circumstance you're in, then your body will adjust. Your pleasure systems will adjust. You'll find delight in other types of foods. You still eat whole fruit? You eat anything sweet?
Yeah, I'll eat fruit. I have things with artificial sweeteners, but I'm basically staying away from added sugars. It's going well.
Are you beginning to notice that the fruit tastes a little sweeter or not yet?
Absolutely. I have to admit, I had an apple, maybe it was yesterday, and I actually took it out of the fridge and was like, oh, this apple's getting kind of old. It doesn't look like it's going to be that good. And I took the first bite and I was like, this is like one of the best apples I've ever eaten in my life.
Isn't that great?
Yeah. Your tastes really do adjust once you stop with the highly processed foods. I think your body knows that there's nutrition in it, and that goes along with it as well. That it's like, this isn't just nonsense calories. This actually has nutrition in it as well. So I think that might even play into it.
It's got micronutrients and guar and pectin and fiber and water, and it comes all wrapped up in a package that nature made for us, right?
Yeah.
What Rob is describing for the benefit of the audience is a phenomenon called upregulation. See, if you have sugar every day or several times a week, then your taste buds stop responding at the same level. It's kind of like if you sleep underneath the subway, you can't sleep for the first couple of weeks, but eventually your brain adjusts and says, well, that stimulus is not that important. You don't really have to hear the train every time. And your brain does the same thing with hyper concentrated forms of starch and sugar and fat and excitotoxins and salt. And, I don't preach abstinence for everyone. I happen not to have sugary foods also, but 2 to 3 of my clients do include them in some way, shape, or form with very specific boundaries and conditions. But when you have it fairly regularly, your taste buds become less sensitive, and so does the dopamine response in your brain, the neurotransmitter that produces pleasure. In the extreme, people get to the point where they feel like they need the sugar just to feel normal. Like they're not really even getting pleasure from it anymore. Their system is just adjusted downwards so much that they actually feel kind of depressed, and the inability to feel pleasure across a lot of the rest of their life if they don't have the sugary foods. But that's all the down regulation of the pleasure system and the taste buds. But the good news is within a month or two, upregulation occurs and your taste buds double in sensitivity, and so does your pleasure system. You get that experience that Rob is talking about where, oh my God, I can't believe I'm having such a pleasurable experience with this first bite of an apple that I thought was going to be horrible. Are you feeling really clear about your definition of sugary food? Sounds like you're doing pretty well with it.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like I'm not looking to skirt the line or try to like push the limit, I guess, because I see the value in sticking with it. I do have like a couple of allowances that technically would be like sugar. After dinner, I do have like 2 hard candies, like a butterscotch hard candy or something like that. That's one of my, I guess, like allowed things.
Tells you that dinner is done. Yeah.
Right, right. It's helpful for me in particular just because that probably lasts maybe 20 to 30 minutes, those 2 hard candies. It gives me time for my dinner to kind of digest and for me to just kind of get that full feeling at the end of the night. After that, it's like dinner is done. I would say the definition is good for what I have in mind.
How is your rule written? What does it actually say?
I guess I don't have like an exact written thing. I could go through like a list of things, and I guess the exceptions are in my opinion the 2 hard candies at the end of the night, and potentially non-sweet foods like if a tomato sauce or something has an added sugar or two, like I'm not too worried about that. And also if there's something like protein powder or maybe like a protein bar or something along those lines that has like a little bit of added sugar, I'm not going to be like a stickler about that, I guess.
I see. Rob, it sounds like you're doing terrific. I don't want to interfere if you don't want to do this. I have more long-term success when we nail that all down in writing. You don't have to do anything different than what you're doing. It sounds like you figured out what the right exceptions are for you. But when you nail it down in writing and you have it in black and white, then that part of ourselves that really wants to cheat becomes much more focused. We can hear it. It can't slip anything by us. So would you mind if I had a shot at just kind of articulating what you're saying in the feature cravings kind of rules? And then if you don't want to do that, that's totally up to you. Are you open to that?
Absolutely. That actually sounds like a good idea because when you asked that and my first response was, yeah, I really should kind of nail this down.
Okay. I'm going to phrase it in a way that's going to sound scary at first, but I promise you we're going to make all the exceptions that you want, okay? The only sweet tastes I'll ever eat or drink again are whole fruit, artificial sweeteners, protein bars, savory sauces, and 2 hard candies after dinner. Is there anything else? Am I leaving anything out that you want to have as an exception?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. I mean, I feel like that's pretty much it.
The benefit of committing to something like this is that if you hear a little voice in your head that says, oh, come on, that ice cream's okay, or, you worked out hard, or, you didn't really have that much at lunch, so you can afford this with dinner, you can define that as your lower self. I call it my inner pig. You can call it whatever you want to. And if I were to commit to this and I heard that little voice, I'd say, wait a minute, that's not me. That's my inner pig. It's squealing for slop. Ice cream is pig slop because I don't eat those things. And let me figure out why it thinks I should do that. And then I can start to pay attention to those thoughts and show the logical fallacies in them. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, so we've clarified the rule. You seem like you feel pretty motivated to stick with this rule. Where do you need help? Would it be helpful to take you through a motivational and kind of rational disputation session to help with anything the pig is saying about why you should break this rule or you shouldn't do it? Or is there something else?
I think I'm pretty solid on the rule.
I want to help you. So tell me what you need.
I guess I wanted to just bounce some ideas off of you in terms of like my own observations about binge eating. And I know you mentioned dopamine before, and I've kind of been doing a bit of research and reading some books and things on dopamine, and I kind of tried to map out how my cravings and things work in terms of dopamine and the brain, I guess. And I was wondering if I could just go through it a bit and if you had like thoughts and opinions on these things, if that was okay.
I'm not the ultimate expert at that, but I know quite a bit. So I'd be happy to have a conversation. Let's do that.
Cool. So, one of the things that I've noticed is that I'll want to binge, right? And the funny thing is, like, I know for a fact, it's undisputable that binging will make me feel much worse. It has happened hundreds of times before, and every single time it has led to the result of me feeling bad physically, mentally, like emotionally, right? But there's still that drive to binge, which almost is completely illogical in a lot of ways. It's like one part of my brain knows that it's going to lead to a binge. But then there's the other part of the brain that's saying, this time is different, right? I guess what I've realized is, or at least what it seems like from the research I've done, is the dopamine is kind of responsible a lot of the time for the craving and the drive to do it, that excitement of like, oh, I'm going to break the rule, right? But that excitement is so short lived. It lasts for like the first bite or two, and then everything subsequent after. And there's so much after. It's like I'm trying to get that spark back. It's like at that time, the dopamine is just kind of plummeting. And it's like I'm just grasping, just trying to eat and eat to try to get it back up because that dopamine spike, that's a very unpleasant feeling because it's like you want more of that dopamine, but it's not working anymore, basically. And I guess that's what's kind of driving, keeping binging. It's like the dopamine itself is responsible for that amp up and craving and excitement, but a lot of the actual pleasure of the food is kind of in a separate neurotransmitters and a separate part of the brain from what I understand. And a lot of that is like oxytocin and serotonin. And those things are not necessarily communicating with the dopamine. So it's kind of like the dopamine is like, this is going to be awesome. This is going to be awesome. And then it's kind of like these other two neurotransmitters are somewhat more responsible for it actually being awesome or not, and they don't communicate with the dopamine in a way that like they can make a deal. Like, I guess it's almost like the dopamine is trying to get you to do something, and then it kind of just leaves when you actually agree to it in a lot of ways.
Kind of like a bad ex-girlfriend, right?
Yeah, yeah. Or like someone that starts a big brawl and then leaves as soon as it starts.
So I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. Tell me how I can help. What questions do you have, or what are you trying to put together for yourself?
I'm trying to kind of get a feeling of how it all works. It's kind of interesting because I think your whole program itself, in a lot of ways, when I learn about these things, it makes so much sense how things are structured and with the rules and things like that. The big why. I guess it's interesting just how backed up it is. When you designed your program and things, was this in your process?
only a little. When I originally designed this 20 years ago to lose 80 pounds and solve my own problems, I'd only took some neurology in graduate school, and then I'd only read a little bit about it. The thing that I understood at the time I designed it was that the reptilian brain had the ability to push the rational brain out of operation when it perceived an emergency. I kind of knew that, and I knew that that meant that trying to love myself thin and psychologically solve all my problems before I stopped overeating was not going to work, because the reptilian brain didn't really know love. It was reacting to a perceived emergency, the need for calories and nutrition, a perceived opportunity, which is this supersized stimulus. Like, we didn't have chocolate bars and pizza and pastries on the savannah. They're artificially concentrated forms of pleasure. And I knew the reptilian brain was responding to that, and it was pushing aside the rational brain. And I knew that I needed something to wake me up at the moment that was happening so I could get back in the rational brain and examine that. And then I really focused on the clinical side of things, just like the very practical aspects of dealing with it myself, the conversations I seem to have with that lower brain and all the justifications, and then dealing with it with clients. And then it's only really in the last 5 to 7 years of working with, we had almost 2,000 clients in that period, that I started to really read about what was happening, with the neurotransmitters. And then I started to understand why the interventions that I created were working on that type of a level. But the interventions didn't really change. It's just kind of like people took more notice of them, and I sounded more sciencey when I talked about it. So I sounded more authoritarian, and people paid more attention. So it's worth doing. Rob, essentially what you're describing is that our brains probably think, for most of us that struggle with overeating or binge eating or eating way beyond our own best judgment, you don't have to diagnose it clinically in order to understand this. When it feels like there's that switch that goes off in your head, almost like someone's pointing a gun to your head and saying, eat, our brains had to be very good at finding calories in nutrition. It was probably scarce, 100,000 years ago, before industry, and you couldn't just walk out to a convenience store and find 1,000 calories. The brain is very attuned to finding, remembering, and repeating the acquisition of calories. This is why if you eat something extraordinarily rich and sugary, that you might find you have a new habit immediately, because the brain says, oh my God, this is the gold mine. This is what we need. Now, it's not really what we need. Industry is faking us out. Modern food environment is faking us out. We weren't really designed to eat these kinds of things, but the brain wants to acquire as many calories as it possibly can when it finds them like that. And then there are a lot of things which influence whether that reaction gets set off. So it's not just the richness and sweetness of the whatever treat you're having. It's also how thoroughly nutrified is your body. Are there genuine nutritional needs underneath that would have your brain on high alert looking for rich sources of calories and nutrition? What's your sleep like? How much brain glucose are you burning over the course of the day, making decision after decision, not just food decisions, but business decisions, family decisions? Decision making kind of burns through your willpower like that. What other activities are signaling your brain that you're safe and secure? Like, do you have enough of a social network? Have you had enough connectedness? Because we're not isolated animals, we're social animals. Did you get enough sleep? Do you have enough water? Are you regulating your temperature in appropriate ways? So you're dressed nice and warm if you're outside in the cold, or you're cooling off enough if it's hot. All of these things influence your brain to go into survival mode. And when your brain is in survival mode, it says, oh my God, we need more calories. Dopamine is the mechanism of learning. It's what gets us excited to go do something. It works on two levels. It's usually connected to a stimulus that was previously associated with food or calories, right? So you pass the donut sign on the highway, you drive into the donut store, you get donuts and a cup of coffee. As you're passing the donut sign, your brain says, oh my God, I'm going to flood you with dopamine because I want you to go get the donuts. And you start to feel happy and excited and really motivated to go get the donuts. If you pass the donut sign and you don't do it, your brain crashes your dopamine levels and makes you very uncomfortable and agitated and edgy. That makes you want to go back and get the donuts. If you don't get the donuts, if you repeatedly go past the donut store and you don't get the donuts, then that connection starts to extinguish, which means you eventually, after 20 or 30 times going past the donut sign, you eventually are not going to get the cravings for donuts. But that connection is not going away. Your brain still knows that there are a lot of calories available at donut stores, but it's been labeled dormant. From a survival perspective, you haven't been successful paying attention to donut signs. You've managed to label the donut sign dormant, and then you're not really bothered by those cravings anymore. Like the actual day-to-day practical implication of all this is you got to get through that extinction curve for every signal that is triggering your craving for donuts if you want to give up donuts. And in your case, your cravings for sugar. You got to get through each of those signals. And you're going to have these intense cravings at first. The only way out is to go through it. And you have to really tell yourself that feelings aren't facts. You have a very clear and precise rule so that you know when the survival drive is active and you're in that moment. And you tell yourself, this is just a feeling. You redirect yourself and say, what do I actually need? So I don't know if I'm answering your question per se, because I've been much more focused on the practical things we need to do to overcome it. I don't publish a lot of scientific research or do a lot of journal articles or anything like that. But you're describing the machinery, like the two different brains that we have, the, oh my God, it's an emergency, we have to survive now, versus relaxing, strategizing, thinking about your long-term goals and dreams and focusing on what you want to accomplish. I don't know if that's satisfying to you or not, but that's what I know about what you're describing.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's interesting, and I think it just makes sense that you discovered this method and came up with it, and then basically it works well, and then it's kind of like the science, like when you started learning more about what's actually going on in the brain, you were like, oh, well, yeah, this actually makes sense. And the fact that you didn't even change anything because it's like practically it works. In some ways, it doesn't really matter why it works, but at the same time, I guess sometimes the knowledge of how the brain works for certain people can actually kind of poke a hole in the pig's message to some extent. It's almost like, oh, this is just my dopamine or something. I guess it's just a slightly different way of just conceptualizing what's going on in your brain.
The other thing that understanding the science does is it helps you recognize that it's not your fault that strong cravings are actually a sign of a healthy brain being corrupted by all these substances we have available today. You don't have a chronic, progressive, mysterious disease. It's not your parents' fault. It's a pattern. It's a bad habit, and it needs to be broken. There were a couple of things that we did change technically, practically, as a result of what we understood with the science. One was when we understood that cravings are connected to specific triggers, and therefore overeating is usually a collection of habits and not a unitary habit. So, for example, your sugary food craving was probably you observed there are 3 or 4 different triggers. I don't know if maybe it's passing a fast food place or working out hard or something. But each of those triggers needs to be identified and extinguished. And so you do that by creating rules that prevent you from rewarding the trigger. And then you initiate an extinction curve for that trigger. And sometimes they all happen at once vis-a-vis the rule that you have. So if these are the only sweet tastes that you're having, then your rule is the only sweet taste you'll ever eat. We're drinking again our whole fruit artificial sweeteners, protein bars, savory sauces, and 2 hard candies after dinner. Well, every other situation, every other trigger is now going to get extinguished. If we go back to the donut example, you now don't stop at the donut store, and so you've extinguished the trigger of the donut sign or the donut store on the way home, and you don't experience cravings for donuts as you're driving home, but you may be at parties, or maybe at your grandma's house. You used to have donuts all the time, and you don't visit her too often, but then you go to your grandma's house and all of a sudden, even though you thought you were completely over donut cravings because you could pass the sign with no big deal, but now you're at grandma's house and oh my God, you're having this incredible craving. That's because grandma's house is a different trigger than the donut store. If you didn't know that, then you would think that you did something wrong, that the process wasn't working, but you actually did something right. You extinguished the donut sign. You just have to extinguish grandma's house now. So that was one thing. And the other thing was that when we understood that the extinction curve is not linear, meaning that the moment you adopt this rule, it's not like your cravings get less and less and less every day, like you're walking down the side of a mountain or something like that. You go through a little bit of a honeymoon period where you're not bothered that much. And then all of a sudden, it's like your inner food monster is throwing a temper tantrum. And you don't know where this came from, but you're having more cravings than you ever had before. What that really is the brain not wanting to give up on a previously good signal that signal the availability of a whole bunch of calories in nutrition, or a whole bunch of calories in most of modern day cases. Once we understood that and could tell people to expect it and tell them that, then as you continue down the road, then it starts to be more linear. But even then, at the end of like 25 to 30 days for a daily habit, you're still going to get a couple of little spikes, a couple of little cravings. It's really not until you reach about 2 months that the craving is labeled completely dormant. Knowing that from the scientific research helped us to prepare people to go into battle without wearing a plastic helmet, and pay particular attention to their nutrition during that period of time and their sleep and all the other things that we talked about. And then also understanding that because binging is a collection of habits and they're connected to specific signals, and some of those signals occur less frequently than others. So passing the donut store happens every day. And so you can go through your 25 to 30 exposures and be largely craving free at the end of a month. Going to see grandma might only happen a couple of times a year. So it's going to take longer before you have enough triggers which you don't reward so that your brain labels grandma's house as dormant. So that understanding has really helped us to prepare people for what they need to go through to extinguish the craving. And the understanding of how quickly cravings form has helped us to have people on the alert for that experience, because you don't want to create a new one if you can avoid it. I always tell the story about my old friend Hank, and he had a bigger eating problem than I did. He actually solved it before I did. And I remember I'd be eating at a diner with him, and he might have a new sandwich or something like that, and he'd go, "Oh no, that's too good. I can't eat that. If it's too good, it's no good." He got into the habit of extinguishing new habits that he didn't want right away. He wouldn't let it go. He would say, "Oh, it's too good. It's no good. I'm not going to eat that." So we tell people if there's something that could be trouble, you might want to be on the alert and at the very least put a boundary around it. Because if you say, "I'll only have that on Saturday mornings at this diner," then your brain will extinguish the other signals. And for 2 to 3 people, that kind of thing works. There are a lot of ways that the science informed what we do on a practical basis. And then there are a lot of ways where it just kind of confirmed why what we were doing is working. So I think I got a little off track, but that's what I think about the science of cravings. And I think it's important. And I still read about it and try to put those things together too.
Absolutely. I mean, I find all of this stuff extremely interesting and helpful just in terms of navigating. And as you said, the great thing is it's like I'm not broken. Like I've heard so many people say to me, "I'm broken. It's not working." And it's like, no, it works too well is almost the issue. And it's like, as you said, our environment has completely changed. We're not hunting and gathering anymore. The dopamine was for going out and going after an animal to eat or gathering berries and things. If you didn't have that dopamine, that drive to do it, then you wouldn't actually do it. But now it's just too easy. I like that you mentioned as well that you call the triggers dormant, because it's like if you go by that donut store all the time and never go in, then great. All it takes is one time to go into that donut store. I've found that if I've had some time of like not going into the donut store, the one time isn't going to set me back to square one necessarily, but it is like for the next week or so, maybe even slightly more, there's going to be cravings to go back in. And what I've noticed is over the past couple of years, I've only had like a couple of real binge episodes, and I've noticed that they come in pairs. It'll be like one day the next day I'll be like, that was so horrible. I can't believe I did that. Why did I do that? This is the worst. I feel bad. Later that day, I do it again. It's interesting because it just shows the dichotomy of the different parts of your brain and what they're after. Another thing that you said with the focusing on the long term goals, from what I understand, that's also like the dopamine system, but it's like a slightly different pathway than the like, eat this sweet food in front of me, like that easy dopamine versus the dopamine of like the long term goals and planning. And it's almost like it's not that we're trying to lower the amount of dopamine we have necessarily. It's almost like we're just changing the pathway in that it's going from like a completely unhealthy and damaging pathway of like instant gratification and those easy dopamine hits to a more worthwhile and just kind of associated with long-term goals. And that type of dopamine doesn't cause those mountains and valleys that are so damaging and kind of give you that up and down feel of excitement and then just that depressed sadness that comes after it. It's kind of like a sustained happiness, I guess.
Contentment.
That is such a more pleasant feeling, and in a lot of ways it's almost like that's what we're going for those easy dopamine hits, is we're trying to get to contentment, and that donut, it'll never do it.
The easy dopamine hits, particularly with the very concentrated forms of calories that don't have as much nutrition in them, what we're really looking for is more of a manic high. It's associated with a depressive low after that. I use the word contentment to contrast to that. It's like the difference between live fast and die young or live slow and enjoy the ride. And I always say that everybody has the right to choose where in that continuum they want to fall. Like, it's not my place to say you shouldn't have donuts, right? I choose not to because I prefer to live slower and enjoy the ride. I've learned the hard way to prefer the contentment of long-term achievement over the instant gratification over the donuts. But it's not my place to judge that. Everybody has to make a decision for themselves where they fall on that continuum and how fast they want to burn the candle. It's a life philosophy. It's a way of life. It's a way of choosing. The thing I wanted to also point out, though, was that you can utilize the brain's capacity for producing short-term dopamine hits in a healthier way, too, because the brain is set up to flood you with dopamine when you find new sources of calories and nutrition. So if you invest the time to discover, learn to make new healthy recipes, and you get a rotation of 20 or 30 different things that you can eat, and you don't eat the same thing all the time, then every meal is still a little bit of a party. My girlfriend made me these stuffed peppers with no salt or flour or oil or anything like that. And she mashed up a little bit of whole potato, and it was white potato. It probably should have been a sweet potato, but I let myself do that sometimes. And she made this hemp seed dressing that went on top of it. And it was different. It was a little bit of a party for me. I recognized the excitement, but I didn't have the crash because I had the nutrition to sustain me. We had it with a whole lot of vegetables and a lot of fiber. If you like invest in learning one new recipe per month and start to rotate them in, there are all sorts of options on YouTube for whatever dietary philosophy you have. I happen to be whole foods plant-based, but they have them for low carbs or macrobiotics or point counters or calorie counter. You can teach yourself to love your healthy food just as much as you used to love the donuts. You don't have to give up the experience of pleasure. When you talk to people after they've switched their diet for a couple of years, they'll tell you that their new diet is the most pleasurable thing that they ever eat, kind of like you were saying about the apple. And nobody believes this from where they're sitting if they're struggling with overeating. But the fact that studies show that people love what they're eating 2 years later if they switch their diet, most people actually become evangelists for their particular diet. It proves to you that the pleasure system is malleable. It's just a matter of training it to respond to healthier things rather than the things that are interfering with your health and fitness goals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. just as you said, I had that same experience with the apple. Sounds very similar because I didn't go through and eat 10 more apples. I ate the apple and was just fully satisfied. And then I wasn't craving anything. Like, it didn't leave me with that low. It just had the high of like, this is really good. And it just sustained me. I was like, oh, nice. And then I went about my day and didn't really think much of it. That's kind of what the difference is, right? If that was some sugary treat, if I didn't go back for more, I would be wanting more. It's so nice to be able to make that transition. But as you said, you have to actually kind of go through the process to get to the other side. And it's like you have to just remember as you're going through, like, it's going to get better. When I think about my habits, just exercise and nutrition now versus what it was some years ago when I was substantially heavier and binge eating every day, basically, it's night and day. And when I was at that point, it was almost as if I could never even envision my life as it is now. I couldn't even think in my wildest dreams, if I tried to draw it up, what it would be like. It wouldn't be as good as it is now. And that process, though, happened kind of step by step. I didn't just go from binge eating every day to the next day being where I am now. You make one rule that's super helpful, and then you're doing well. Maybe I could tighten some other things up. Maybe I could start exercising. You don't have to if your goals are still being met, but it's kind of like you get better. Once you get better, you can kind of decide where you want to go. That in itself is motivating, just the fact that you can actually grow and become better. It happens gradually.
I couldn't agree more. We're starting to run a little bit short on time. It sounds like you've got more to say. I'd be happy to do this again with you if you want to sometime. Any one last thought or burning observation that you wanted to share before we go?
I'm just extremely grateful for all of the work that you've done, and it has helped me so much. I've lost about 150 pounds, and this program has just been such a huge influence. Your podcast, everything. It's just been amazing. I just wanted to say thank you so much for doing what you do. I really appreciate it.
Rob, that does my heart good. Thank you, too.
And that brings us to the end of today's broadcast of Defeat Your Cravings, hosted by Dr. Glenn Livingston. If you'd like to find out more about the products and services Dr. Glenn offers to help you dramatically reduce your cravings and stop overeating in 90 days or less, please visit defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. That's defeatyourcravingscoaching.com. Thanks.